Before the late 1800s, much of Africa was a great mystery to Europe. They knew the coasts where they had traded for centuries, but the vast interior was a place of legend. It was often called the Dark Continent, not because of its people, but because it was so unknown. Yet a change was coming. A powerful new interest was growing. The Industrial Revolution had created giant factories. These factories were hungry. They needed raw materials like rubber, cotton, palm oil, precious metals to keep their machines running and to produce goods. Africa seemed to hold these treasures in abundance. This economic hunger pulled Europe's gaze south. It was also a time of fierce competition: Britain, France, Germany, Belgium. Each wanted to be the most powerful, the wealthiest, the most influential. Building empires was a sign of greatness. Colonies meant more resources, more markets, more prestige. Africa became the ultimate prize. Another reason was a claimed moral duty. Many Europeans believed their civilization was superior. They felt they had a mission to bring Christianity, commerce, their way of life to other lands. While some meant well, this belief justified political and economic exploitation. Economic greed, national pride, misplaced sense of duty created a perfect storm. Desire for resources, empire competition, and the civilizing claim came together. By the 1880s, it became a frantic rush. European agents made treaties with local chiefs, often in ways chiefs did not understand, to claim land for their countries. The rush could lead to war among European powers. They needed a way to manage competition and divide Africa without fighting. The solution? A meeting. A conference to set the rules. To avoid a potential war among themselves, the leaders of Europe needed to talk. The idea for a conference came from Portugal, but Otto von Bismarck organized it. Bismarck was a clever statesman. He saw an opportunity for Germany to increase its influence. By hosting the meeting, he could position Germany as a key player and claim a share of African territory. Berlin, the capital of the newly unified German Empire, was chosen. It was far removed from the lands whose futures were about to be decided. The conference began on a cold day, November 15, 1884. Discussions continued for more than 3 months, ending February 26, 1885. The setting was grand. Bismarck's official residence on Wilhelmstrasse, opulent rooms, maps and globes, delegates negotiating. They created rules for claiming parts of Africa. Officially, regulate trade and navigation on the Congo and Niger rivers. Unofficially, divide an entire continent among themselves. The scramble for Africa had already begun. King Leopold II of Belgium had laid a personal claim to the Congo basin. His agents created a private colony. The French expanded from the west. The British secured territories in the south and east. This chaotic land grab created tension. The Berlin Conference aimed to press pause and formalize the scramble, to turn a mad dash into an organized process, benefiting European powers and preventing them from fighting over the spoils. It was a gathering of the wealthy and powerful, focused on securing economic and political advantage. Imagine powerful men from distant lands gathering in Europe to draw lines on a map they'd never seen. The air was filled with talk of commerce, navigation rights, spheres of influence. They spoke of bringing civilization and ending the slave trade, while masking self-interest. Outside those closed doors, across oceans, lived millions in hundreds of societies, each with its own history, culture, and political structure. Their voices were not heard in Berlin. Their fate was decided for them by strangers in a cold European winter. The guest list for the Berlin Conference was a roll call of the world's most powerful nations at the time. 14 countries sent their representatives. The major players were Britain. Britain wanted to secure its territories and key trade routes. From Egypt in the north down to South Africa. France. France aimed for a massive empire in West and North Africa. Germany. Germany was the newcomer wanting colonies. Portugal. Portugal wanted its centuries-old coastal claims recognized and expanded. Other European nations also came, hoping for a piece of the pie. King Leopold II of Belgium had a very personal agenda. He acted through his own private organization to claim the Congo Basin. Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Austria, Hungary. The United States sent an observer but claimed no territory. The most important figure at the conference was the host, Otto von Bismarck. He was chancellor and a master of diplomacy. He used the conference to boost Germany's prestige and manage rivalries between Britain and France. Another key figure was King Leopold II. Through PR and diplomacy, he convinced nations to recognize his personal control over the Congo Free State. He promised civilization and free trade. Promises later broken in brutal ways. The shocking truth is, who was not there? Not a single king, not a single queen, Not a single chief, not a single community leader. The people whose lands were being divided had no seat at the table. They were spoken about as if they were not there. The architects of this new map were all European, drawing lines based on their own interests, with no regard for the human reality on the ground. The main outcome of the 3 months of meetings was a document known as the General Act of the Berlin Conference. This document laid out the rules for the ongoing scramble for Africa. It was not a map that divided the continent then and there. Instead, it was a rule book for how the division should happen. The primary goal was to ensure that the process was peaceful, at least for the Europeans. One of the most important rules established was the principle of effective occupation. This principle meant that a European power could only claim a part of the African coast if it actually had a presence there. It was no longer enough to simply plant a flag. A country had to establish real control. This principle of effective occupation created a new urgency. To prove effective occupation, a country had to have administrators on the ground. To prove effective occupation, a country had to have troops on the ground. To prove effective occupation, a country had to have police on the ground. It had to show that it could govern the area. This rule had a massive impact. It immediately triggered a race from the coastlines into the interior of the continent. European troops boarding boats, soldiers disembarking on African shores with equipment. This led to many more treaties being signed with local leaders, often through deception or force, and it also led to numerous violent conflicts as African communities resisted this sudden invasion of their lands. The rule designed to prevent war in Europe directly caused many wars in Africa. The General Act also addressed other issues. It declared the Congo River Basin and the Niger River Basin to be neutral and open for free trade to all nations. This was especially important for securing King Leopold II's claim to the Congo. By promising that his Congo Free State would be a free trade zone, he gained the support of other nations who hoped to profit from the region's resources. The act also included a resolution to work towards ending the slave trade by land and by sea within Africa. This was presented as a great moral achievement of the conference. However, while it was a noble goal, it was often used as a justification for conquest, and the forced labor that soon followed in many colonies was, in practice, not very different from slavery itself. So, the conference did not actually draw the borders of Africa in that room in Berlin. Instead, it set up a system for how those borders would be drawn in the years that followed. Any European power that wanted to claim a new territory had to notify the other signatory powers so they could make a counterclaim if they wished. This created a formal bureaucratic process for colonization. It transformed the chaotic scramble into a legalized, internationally recognized project of imperial expansion. After the Berlin Conference ended in 1885, the real work of division began. The principle of effective occupation meant European powers had to quickly establish a physical presence in the lands they wanted. This led to a frenzy of activity across the continent. Expeditions were sent out, not for exploration but for annexation. Soldiers, administrators, company agents planting flags and establishing small outposts. Their goal was to claim as much land as possible as quickly as possible before a rival European power could get there first. The map of Africa, which had been largely blank to Europeans, was about to be filled in with colors. Red for Britain, blue for France, green for Germany, and so on. The process of drawing these new borders was done with an almost complete ignorance of the people who lived there. The lines were often drawn in straight lines, from one point on a map to another. These lines were convenient for European diplomats negotiating in faraway capitals, but they were devastating on the ground. They cut right through the middle of established kingdoms, ethnic groups, and trading networks that had existed for centuries. A single community, with a shared language and culture, could suddenly find itself split between two different colonies, one controlled by the British and the other by the French. They were now separated by an artificial border, expected to speak different European languages and obey different laws. At the same time, the new colonial borders forced groups of people who were historical rivals or had no connection to each other into a single political unit. People with different languages, religions, and social systems were suddenly declared citizens of a new colony called Nigeria or the Belgian Congo. This created immediate and lasting tension. The European powers often used a strategy of divide and rule, where they would favor one ethnic group over others to help them maintain control. This created resentment and conflict between groups that would simmer for decades, and in many cases, erupt into violence long after the colonial powers had left. By the beginning of the 20th century, just a few years after the Berlin Conference, The partition of Africa was nearly complete. The results were staggering. In 1870, about 10% of Africa was under European control. By 1914, that figure had jumped to around 90%. Only two nations on the entire continent remained independent: Ethiopia, Liberia. The rest of Africa was a patchwork of colonies, protectorates, and territories, ruled by Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, Spain. The scramble had been a success, at least from the European point of view. A continent had been claimed with minimal conflict between the colonizers. The new borders created by this division were completely artificial. They did not follow the natural lines of mountains or rivers, nor did they respect the cultural and ethnic landscapes of the continent. About 70% of the borders drawn in Africa were geometric lines, straight lines drawn by men with rulers in European offices. These lines had immediate and devastating consequences for the African people. They split an estimated 190 culture groups. Families were separated, ancient trade routes were disrupted, pastoral communities were cut off from their traditional grazing lands and water sources. The new colonial states were fragile constructions, forcing diverse and often hostile peoples to live together under a single foreign administration. The primary purpose of the colonies was to serve the economic interests of the European powers. Colonial economies were restructured to focus on the extraction of raw materials. Africans were forced, often through heavy taxes and direct violence, to grow cash crops or work in mines: cocoa, cotton, gold, diamonds, copper. This new economic system destroyed traditional self-sufficient farming practices and made African economies dependent on Europe. The wealth of Africa, its minerals, its timber, its agricultural products, was shipped away to fuel European industries, leaving very little benefit for the local populations. The infrastructure that was built, like railways, was designed to get resources from the interior to the coast, not to connect African communities with each other. The social and political structures of African societies were also fundamentally changed. Traditional rulers, like kings and chiefs, lost their power. Some were removed, while others were allowed to stay on as local administrators for the colonial government. This often corrupted their authority and made them unpopular with their own people. New legal systems were imposed, European languages were introduced, and Western education was introduced, primarily to train a small number of Africans to work as clerks and low-level administrators. The borders were not just lines on a map, they were instruments of control and division. Throughout this entire process, African people were not consulted. Their own systems of government, their ancient borders, and their complex social relationships were completely ignored. The continent was treated as a blank slate, an empty piece of property to be divided among outsiders. When African communities resisted this invasion, they were often met with overwhelming military force. The new technologies of warfare, such as the Maxim machine gun, gave the European armies a terrible advantage. The division of Africa was not a peaceful, administrative process. It was an act of conquest, carried out with little to no regard for the human cost. The lines drawn in the late 19th century were etched onto the continent in violence and blood. Today, more than a century after the Berlin Conference, its legacy continues to shape the African continent in profound ways. Most African nations gained their independence in the mid-20th century, but they inherited the borders that were drawn by the colonial powers. These artificial borders are now the official boundaries of Africa's 54 countries. The problem of ethnic groups being split across borders or rival groups being forced into one nation remains a major source of political instability. This has contributed to civil wars, border disputes, secessionist movements in many parts of the continent, from Nigeria to the Democratic Republic of Congo. The political map of modern Africa is a direct and often problematic inheritance from the Scramble. The economic structures established during the colonial era have also proven difficult to change. Many African economies are still heavily reliant on the export of a few raw materials like oil, cocoa, minerals to Europe and other parts of the world. This makes them vulnerable to changes in global market prices. The infrastructure, like roads and railways, often still reflects the old colonial goal of moving resources to ports, rather than connecting regions within and between countries to promote internal trade. This economic dependency, sometimes called neo-colonialism, makes it challenging for African nations to achieve full economic independence and build diverse, resilient economies that serve their own people first. Furthermore, the imposition of European languages and political systems has had a lasting impact. While languages like English, French, Portuguese can serve as a unifying force in countries with many local languages, they also represent a break from indigenous cultures and traditions. The political models left behind by the colonizers, often based on a strong central state, have sometimes struggled to accommodate the diverse and decentralized nature of many African societies. The challenge of building a national identity in countries created by colonial mapmakers is a task that African leaders and citizens continue to grapple with today. It is a process of taking the states they inherited and trying to make them their own. The shocking truth behind Africa's division is not just that it happened, but that its consequences are still so visible. The Berlin Conference stands as a powerful symbol of a time when an entire continent was treated as a prize to be won, its people's futures decided by powerful outsiders. Understanding this history is essential for understanding many of the challenges and opportunities facing Africa today. The continent's story is one of incredible resilience, a story of diverse peoples and nations working to overcome a difficult past and build a more prosperous and peaceful future on their own terms. The echoes of Berlin are fading, but they have not disappeared.